She felt the cold metal slide onto her finger and knew it was not love that placed it there. The chapel was filled with candlelight and silk and the soft murmur of titled guests, but Evangeline saw none of it. She saw only his hands. The Duke of Ashworth had hands that could gentle a frightened horse or sign a political treaty without a tremor, yet when he lifted her veil and looked at her for the first time as his wife, his eyes passed through her as if she were a stranger standing in someone else's gown. He spoke his vows without hesitation, without warmth. When the Archbishop pronounced them man and wife, Alexander did not lean forward to kiss her. He simply offered his arm and led her down the aisle, nodding to the assembled lords and ladies as though this were a minor estate matter that required his brief attention. Evangeline kept her chin high. She had been raised to endure, and she had loved him for 3 silent years before this day. She had loved the way he bowed his head slightly when listening to his tenets, the way his rare smile transformed his stern face, the way he carried his daughter Lily on his shoulders through the gardens at the Ashworth Summer Fair when he thought no one was looking. She had loved him from the shadowed corner of a ballroom where he never once noticed her. And now she was his wife. She told herself that the coldness was only the weight of formality, that tonight or tomorrow or in a week he would finally see her. That hope lasted exactly 4 hours. The wedding breakfast was held in the grand hall of Ashworth Park. Alexander sat at the head of the table, speaking quietly with his steward about drainage in the lower fields. Evangeline sat to his left, arranging and rearranging the food on her plate. When an older countess asked her how she was enjoying married life so far, Evangeline smiled and said it was everything she had dreamed. The countess's eyes flickered with pity. After the meal, Alexander escorted her to the east wing, to a chamber that was elegant and utterly separate from his own. A maid had already unpacked her things. The Duchess's rooms, he called them, and the name felt like a title pressed into a book that nobody intended to read. He paused at the doorway. His dark hair caught the firelight, and for a moment something almost human moved in his gray eyes. "I trust you will be comfortable," he said. Then he left. Evangeline stood in the center of her beautiful, silent room and listened to his footsteps fade down the corridor. She did not cry. She was the Duchess of Ashworth now, and duchesses did not cry on their wedding day. She only pressed her palm against the cold brocade of the bed curtain and breathed until the tightness in her chest eased enough to move again. In the days that followed, she tried. She rose early each morning, dressed with care, and made her way to the breakfast parlor. Alexander was always already there, coffee cup in hand, correspondence spread before him. He would glance up, offer a polite good morning, and return to his letters. She learned to read the weather of his silences. When she asked if she might accompany him on his ride through the estate, he declined. He preferred to ride alone. When she offered to review household accounts, he told her the housekeeper had managed perfectly well for years and need not be disturbed. When she found a rare volume of poetry in the library and left it open on his desk with a small pressed flower marking a verse about hope, she returned later to find the flower swept into the wastebasket and the book returned to its shelf. She told herself he needed time. The first person who truly welcomed her at Ashworth Park was not her husband. It was Lily. The child was 5 years old, with her mother's auburn curls and her father's serious gray eyes. She had been silent and wary since her mother's death 3 years before, retreating into nursery corners with her dolls and refusing to speak to the string of governesses who had come and gone. Evangeline did not push. She simply began visiting the nursery each afternoon, sitting on the window seat with a book in her lap, reading aloud whether Lily appeared to listen or not. On the 4th day, Lily crept close enough to see the pictures. On the 7th day, she climbed onto the window seat and leaned her head against Evangeline's arm. When Lily spoke her first full sentence in months, "Will you read it again?" Evangeline felt a warmth spread through her chest that almost made the cold mornings bearable. She thought perhaps Alexander would notice. She thought perhaps the way Lily began to laugh at dinner, the way she reached for Evangeline's hand in the garden, might soften something in him. But Alexander only watched from a distance, his expression unreadable, and excused himself early from the table. One evening, Evangeline gathered her courage and knocked on the door of his study. He was seated before the fire, a glass of brandy untouched on the table beside him, staring at the miniature portrait of his first wife that he kept on the mantel. Helena. She had been beautiful, everyone said. Golden, laughing, effortlessly beloved. He did not turn when Evangeline entered. "Your Grace," she said softly, "I wondered if we might speak. Is something amiss?" "No, nothing is amiss. I only thought," she clasped her hands before her to still their trembling, "I only thought we might come to know one another better. We are married after all." He was silent for a long moment. Then he rose and turned to face her, and his eyes were not unkind, but they were sealed, closed to her utterly. "This marriage was a necessity," he said. "For Lily, for the title. I have given you my name and my protection. I cannot give you more than that. I am sorry if you expected otherwise." She heard the words as clearly as if he had spoken them one by one into her heart. He could not give her more. Not would not, could not. She nodded. Her throat was too tight for speech. She curtsied and left the room, closing the door quietly behind her, and only when she reached her cold, separate chamber did she allow herself to understand what he meant. He was still in love with a ghost, and there was no room in a haunted house for a living wife. The first public humiliation came at the Whitmore ball 6 weeks later. Evangeline had spent hours preparing. Her gown was pale blue silk, her hair dressed with pearls that had belonged to Alexander's mother. She stood at his side as they entered the ballroom, and for one brief, shining moment, she felt almost like a true duchess. Then Lady Cecily Pembroke approached. She was golden, like Helena had been. Golden hair, golden laugh, golden history with the Duke of Ashworth. The tongue whispered that she had expected to become the second Duchess, that she and Alexander had shared a summer of quiet understanding before Evangeline's family contract had been announced. Cecily greeted Alexander with warm familiarity, placing her gloved hand on his sleeve, leaning close to murmur something that made his stern mouth almost soften. She barely glanced at Evangeline. "Your Grace," she said, with the barest inclination of her head. Then she turned back to Alexander, and the two of them walked away into the crowd, leaving Evangeline standing alone at the edge of the dance floor. She felt the stares. The whispers rustled like dry leaves at her back. The new Duchess, they said, married for convenience. He cannot bear to look at her. Have you seen how he never dances with her? Poor thing. Poor, poor thing. She held her smile in place until her cheeks ached. She accepted a glass of lemonade from a passing footman and sipped it slowly, pretending to admire the flowers, pretending she did not notice her husband across the room, his head bent close to Lady Cecily's, his attention entirely elsewhere. When the quadrille began, an elderly baron asked her to dance out of obvious charity. She accepted because refusing would have been worse. She moved through the steps with mechanical grace, and every time the pattern brought her within sight of Alexander, he was not looking at her. He was looking at Cecily. That night in her silent chamber, Evangeline unpinned her pearls and placed them carefully back in their velvet case. She looked at herself in the mirror. She was not ugly. She was not foolish. She was a gentleman's daughter with a kind heart and a steady spirit, and she had done nothing to deserve the slow, quiet devastation of being invisible in her own marriage. Something shifted inside her then, a small, hard resolution. If he could not love her, she would stop hopping for it. She would find another way to fill her life. The change did not happen overnight. It happened in small, deliberate steps that no one else thought to notice. Evangeline began to spend her mornings in the village. She visited the tenants' cottages, speaking with the women about their children, their gardens, their winter stores. She learned their names. She remembered their stories. When she discovered that the nearest school was 5 miles away and most village children could not attend, she did not petition Alexander for permission. She simply ordered the old dower cottage cleared, hired a young schoolmistress from the county town, and began funding lessons from her own small allowance. The school opened on a gray October morning with 12 children and a basket of bread and apples. Evangeline stood in the doorway, watching their eager faces bend over slates, and felt something she had not felt since her wedding day: purpose. Lily began accompanying her to the village. The child who had once refused to speak now chattered about the children she met, the stories the schoolmistress told, the cat that lived behind the baker's shop. Evangeline listened and laughed and felt her heart mend slightly around the edges, even if the center remained raw. At home, she was courteous to Alexander. She greeted him at breakfast, inquired after his business, listened to his brief replies, and asked nothing more. She no longer lingered in doorways hoping he would speak to her. She no longer left books on his desk or flowers in his study. She had given him her hope once, and he had let it fall, and she was not a woman who could keep offering what was not wanted. She thought he would be relieved by the distance. And at first he seemed to be. But then slowly, something began to change. It started with small things. A pause at the breakfast table when she excused herself earlier than usual. A glance toward the empty chair in the drawing room where she had once sat each evening with her embroidery. A question, asked with careful indifference, about where she had spent her afternoon. "The village," she answered. "The school roof needed repairs, and I wished to see it done before the rains." He nodded and said nothing more, but his eyes followed her as she left the room. The first real shift came on a Sunday afternoon in November. Lord Daniel Ashford, a distant cousin of Alexander, arrived at Ashworth Park for a fortnight's visit. He was a young man with a ready smile and a gentle manner, recently returned from a diplomatic posting in Vienna. He had no title of his own but a comfortable competence and a reputation for kindness. He met Evangeline in the garden, where she was helping Lily plant bulbs for the spring. "Your Grace," he said, bowing with easy warmth, "I have heard much about your school in the village. My valet's nephew attends, and the boy has not stopped talking of it." Evangeline smiled, surprised and pleased. "I am glad to hear it. We hope to add a second room by summer. If you need additional funding, I would be honored to contribute." She accepted his offer with genuine gratitude, and they walked together through the garden, discussing books and travel and the state of the village roads, while Lily ran ahead chasing falling leaves. From the library window, Alexander watched them. He saw Evangeline laugh at something Daniel said. He saw the way she tilted her head, the way the autumn light caught the chestnut strands of her hair, the easy grace with which she moved. He saw Daniel offer her his arm to step over a damp patch of grass, and he saw her take it. Something unfamiliar tightened in his chest. Something that felt very much like a door he had thought was locked suddenly rattling on its hinges. At dinner that evening, he found himself watching her again. She was seated across the table, speaking with Daniel about the Viennese opera, her eyes bright with interest. She did not glance toward the head of the table. She did not seek Alexander's gaze or approval. She was entirely present in her conversation, entirely alive, and she had not looked at him once since the soup course. He realized, with a strange hollow ache, that he could not remember the last time she had looked at him at all. The fortnight of Daniel's visit stretched like a ribbon of small, sharp moments. Daniel accompanied Evangeline to the village school. He read stories to the children and made them laugh. He brought Lily a wooden music box from Vienna that played a tune she adored. He walked with Evangeline in the garden each afternoon, and their laughter floated up to the house like the scent of late roses. Alexander began to find reasons to be where they were. He reviewed estate papers in the library, whose windows overlooked the garden path. He took his coffee in the morning room, where Evangeline and Daniel often sat discussing village affairs. He even appeared at the school one afternoon, standing in the doorway in his greatcoat, watching Evangeline kneel beside a child's desk to guide his hand on the slate. When she looked up and saw him, her expression did not change. She simply nodded a polite acknowledgement and returned her attention to the child. He had expected surprise, pleasure, something. The absence of it stung more than he could explain. That night, he knocked on the door of her sitting room. She was reading by the fire, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She looked up, and for the first time in weeks he saw something flicker in her eyes. Not hope, something closer to wariness. "Your Grace," she said, marking her place in the book, "is something amiss?" The echo of her own words from months ago struck him. He stood in the doorway, suddenly uncertain. "I wish to speak with you," he said. She waited. "You and Daniel," he began and stopped. He had not planned the words. They simply rose, unbidden and unwise. "You spend a great deal of time together." Evangeline's expression did not change, but a quiet understanding settled into her eyes. "Lord Ashford has been kind enough to assist with the school. He is a friend. He is a man." "Yes." She closed her book and set it aside. "He is a man who has shown me friendship when I had none. I did not realize that required your approval." The words were calm. They were not angry, but they cut him more cleanly than any blade because they held no hope of his understanding. She was not asking for his permission. She was not seeking his regard. She had stopped. "I only meant," he said, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears, "that I would not wish for anyone to misinterpret your kindness." "Interpret it as what?" He had no answer. Evangeline rose and walked to the window, her back to him. "I have been a faithful wife to you, Alexander. I have cared for your daughter. I have managed your household and asked for nothing. If my friendship with Lord Ashford troubles you, I shall be more discreet. But I will not apologize for seeking companionship in a house where I have been alone since the day I arrived." The silence that followed was long and taut. When she turned back, her eyes were dry, but they held something that made his breath catch, something that looked like goodbye. "I am tired," she said. "If there is nothing else, I would like to retire." He left her room, with words unspoken pressing against his throat. The discovery came 2 days later, entirely by accident. Alexander was searching his late wife's writing desk for a misplaced estate document when he found the letter. It was tucked inside a leather folio he had not opened in years, addressed to him in Helena's elegant hand. He almost set it aside unread. The grief was still a low, constant ache, and he had learned to live around it like a man learning to breathe with a cracked rib. But something, the date on the letter, perhaps, or the faint trace of lavender that still clung to the paper, made him unfold it and begin to read. "My dearest Alexander, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are alone with our Lily, and my heart breaks for you both. I have made my peace with what is coming, but I cannot rest until I know that you will not close yourself away from the world. You will want to mourn. You will want to lock the doors of your heart and throw away the key. I know you, my love. I know the way you will turn to stone because feeling is too painful, but Lily needs a mother and you need a reason to live again. I have thought long about this, and there is a young woman I have chosen for you. Her name is Evangeline Clare. You will not know her. She is the daughter of Sir Edmund Clare, a quiet girl who visited me often during my illness. She read to me. She held my hand. She promised me, Alexander, she promised me on her soul that she would love you and our daughter if ever you would let her. I asked her if she could give her heart to a man who might not yet be ready to receive it. She told me she had loved you for years, silently, from a distance, without any hope of return. She told me she would consider it the greatest honor of her life to care for my family. She is not me. She will never be me. But she is good, and she is steadfast, and she has a quiet courage that will not crumble under the weight of your grief. Let her in, my darling. Do not let my memory become a wall between you and the living. That is my last wish. That is my prayer. Yours always, Helena. The letter trembled in Alexander's hands. He read it twice, 3 times. The words blurred and sharpened and blurred again. She had loved him for years, silently, from a distance. She had sat beside Helena while she was dying, had held her hand, had made a promise she had no obligation to keep. She had come to this house not for position, not for duty, not because her family wished it, but because she had promised a dying woman that she would love a man who could not love her back. And he had left her alone. He had swept her flower into the wastebasket. He had let her stand invisible at a ball while he spoke with another woman. He had told her in the quiet of his study that he could not give her more. He sat in the chair by the cold hearth, Helena's letter pressed against his chest, and for the first time in 3 years he wept. He found Evangeline in the nursery, reading to Lily. She sat in the window seat, the child curled against her side, the book open to a story about a brave little sparrow. The afternoon light fell softly across her face, and she was smiling, a quiet, contented smile he had not seen directed at him in so long he had forgotten what it looked like. She looked up when he entered, and her smile faded into that careful, neutral expression she now wore whenever he was near. "Lily," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, "could you go with Nanny for a little while? I need to speak with the Duchess." Lily looked at Evangeline, who nodded and pressed a kiss to the child's curls. When they were alone, the silence stretched between them like a fragile thread. Alexander did not know how to begin. He had spent 3 years building a fortress around his heart, and now the walls were crumbling, and he was standing in the rubble with no idea how to ask for forgiveness. "I found a letter," he said at last, "from Helena." Evangeline's face went very still. "She told me about your visits to her, about the promise you made." Evangeline looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. "I did not want you to know. It would have felt like asking for gratitude I had not earned." "You have earned everything." He took a step toward her, then stopped, afraid to push too quickly. "You sat with my dying wife. You promised to love my child. You came here knowing I might never love you, and you did it anyway. Why?" She was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "Because I loved you. I had loved you since the first time I saw you at a county assembly, 3 years before Helena died. You asked me to dance once, do you remember? A country reel. You smiled at me, and I thought my heart would stop. You never looked at me again after that night. But I remembered." Alexander closed his eyes. He remembered that assembly. He remembered a pretty girl in a blue gown who had laughed when he stumbled over the steps. He had not thought of her since. "I am sorry," he said. The words felt pathetically small. "I am sorry for every day I made you feel invisible, for every moment I chose grief over the living woman standing beside me." She looked up at him then, and her eyes were wet but not falling. "You were not ready." "I was a fool." "Yes," she said quietly, "you were." The honesty of it cut him, and he deserved the cut. He knelt before her, something he had never done for anyone, and took her hands in his. "I do not know if it is too late," he said. "I do not know if you can ever feel for me what you once did, but I am asking you, begging you, to let me try, to let me be the husband I should have been from the start." She looked at him for a long, searching moment. Then she pulled her hands gently from his grasp. "I need time," she said. The words were not no, but they were not yes either. He nodded and rose and left the nursery with his heart beating a strange new rhythm in his chest. Hoping. The days that followed were unlike any that had come before. Alexander did not retreat. He did not return to his study and his silences. He began, instead, to court his own wife. He left a book of poetry on her breakfast plate, not with a pressed flower, but with a note in his own hand. "I read this and thought of you." He invited her to ride with him along the east fields, and when she agreed, he kept his horse at a gentle walk beside hers and pointed out the places where he had played as a boy. He began to join her at the village school, not standing in the doorway but sitting among the children, letting them show him their slates, meeting the schoolmistress, learning the names Evangeline already knew by heart. He told her about Helena, not the perfect golden wife of his memory, but the real woman, her quick temper, her terrible singing, her habit of stealing the blankets on cold nights. He told her about the day Helena died, the way the light had left the world, the way he had promised himself he would never feel such pain again. Evangeline listened. She did not offer easy comfort, but she stayed beside him, and slowly the wall between them grew thinner. The second revelation came on a day of unexpected crisis. Lily had wandered away from her nursemaid during a walk near the home woods. By the time the alarm was raised, she had been missing for over an hour. Evangeline was the one who found her at the edge of the old mill pond, her foot caught in a tangle of roots, her face streaked with tears. Evangeline pulled her free and carried her all the way back to the house, her arms trembling with the weight, refusing to let anyone take the child from her. When Alexander reached them, his face white with fear, he found Evangeline sitting on the hall floor with Lily in her lap, stroking her hair, murmuring soft reassurances. He knelt beside them, gathering them both into his arms, and he did not let go for a long time. Later that night, when Lily was asleep and the house was quiet, Evangeline found him in the library. He was staring into the fire, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "You saved her," he said, his voice hoarse. "Again." She paused again. "The riding accident 2 years ago. A woman pulled her from the path of a bolting horse at the village fair. Lily described her to me 100 times: dark hair, a blue cloak, a silver locket. I searched for her. I wanted to thank her. It was you, wasn't it?" Evangeline's hand moved instinctively to the locket at her throat. She had worn it every day since her mother gave it to her at 16. She had never thought to mention that day at the fair. It had not seemed important. "Yes," she said simply. Alexander crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. He held her as though she might dissolve, his face buried in her hair, his breath uneven. "You have been saving us from the very beginning," he whispered, "and I was too blind to see it." She did not pull away this time. She let herself be held, and the tears she had refused to shed for so long finally came, quiet and cleansing, soaking into the shoulder of his coat. "I loved you too late," he said, "but I love you now. I love you now, Evangeline. If you can believe nothing else, believe that." She looked up at him, her eyes shining, and saw something she had never seen before. The walls were gone. The sealed gray eyes were open, raw, terrified, and utterly, completely hers. "I never stopped loving you," she said. "I only stopped hoping you would love me back." He kissed her then, gently, reverently, as though she were the miracle she had always been without his noticing. And in the quiet of the library, with the fire crackling and the weight of years finally lifted, they held each other and began the long, slow work of healing. Spring came early to Ashworth Park that year. The gardens burst into color, and Lily ran through them shrieking with laughter, her dark curls flying behind her. Daniel Ashford returned for a visit and found the Duke and Duchess walking arm in arm along the gravel path, their heads bent together in quiet conversation. He smiled, bowed, and retreated to the library, content to have been, for a brief season, a friend to a woman who had needed one. The village school opened its 2nd room in May, and Alexander himself attended the ceremony, standing beside Evangeline as the children sang a song they had learned. He held her hand throughout, and when the children finished, he was the first to applaud. Lady Cecily Pembroke sent a letter of congratulations that went unanswered. And in the evenings, when the house was quiet and Lily was tucked into bed with her wooden music box playing its soft Viennese tune, Alexander and Evangeline would sit together in the library that had once been a place of solitude. They read aloud to each other. They talked about the estate, the village, their plans for the future. Sometimes they simply sat in silence, her head resting against his shoulder, his hand covering hers, the firelight dancing across their faces. One night, he placed a velvet box in her lap. Inside was a bracelet set with small, perfect sapphires, each one the color of a morning sky after a long darkness. "For every day I did not see you," he said, "I will spend the rest of my life making up for them." Evangeline smiled, and it was not the careful smile of a duchess performing for the world. It was the smile of a woman who had walked through loneliness and come out the other side into a light she had almost stopped believing in. "You do not need to make up for anything," she said. "You are here, that is enough." He lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm, and she felt the warmth of it travel all the way to the center of her mended heart. Outside, the night was soft and full of stars. Inside, the house that had once been a tomb for a ghost was alive with quiet, steadfast love. And Evangeline, who had once stood alone while everyone whispered, never stood alone again.